Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Command Q, the podcast for quitters. We're your hosts, Maari Casey.
And I'm John Pelfrey.
And today's episode goes out to everyone who is sick and tired of driving themselves crazy. We're all getting into a time of year when most of us have about 30 different things on our minds at all times. And that mental overload makes it very challenging to sort out our priorities and to put our focus where it needs to go.
Today, we have mindfulness expert and meditation coach, Jarret Levine. Jarret is a meditation instructor at Shala Yoga in Durham, a business that he co-owns with his wife, Maari. He hosts workshops all over Durham, teaching the art of stillness or quietude. We really enjoyed our conversation with Jarret and his perspective on finding quiet. Let's jump right into our talk. To get this thing kicked off, we usually come up with some sort of icebreaker. We were talking yesterday about meditation in general. The question came up like, what's your meditation record?
I would have no idea how to tell you that. That's not really how I practice. It's more about like when I'm in retreat, how many hours in succession is the better way to think about it. Because if on long-term retreat, what we'll do is do 24-minute sessions, 6-minute break, 24-minute session, 6-minute break, which, is an hour's time. Yeah. So you'll keep going. And I've done that for 14 hours.
Wow.
Straight. When I was a kid, I used to have these terrible nightmares. Did you guys ever see a movie called The Believers?
No.
It's a really terrible,
don't watch it.
Scary. Yeah, I was a kid, so I'm not really sure what it would look like now, but I was a kid and it scared the hell out of me. I mean, it really wasn't scary. Anyway, in the film, the mother of this child, just in this freak accident, gets electrocuted by a coffee pot. She spills something happens, there's a short, it's just like, kills her. And I had this nightmare for like at least 2 months that every night I wake up from my mother having that. And so my mom gave me like some love and a little prayer from her world. And I started to intuit, instead of the mouse in the mouse hole, because I was a basketball player, it was a basketball and a basketball hoop. And it was just that idea, it's very difficult to get the ball in the hoop in your mind. I mean, for me, it was. To get it in, it would like get close and it would like squirrely around and go everywhere. It's very difficult to get it to go in, but in the practice of kind of trying to do that, it started to develop that level of quietude, or in the Indo-Tibetan psychological approaches that I sort of spent the bulk of my time in this, they call it shamatha, or single pointed concentration. It just means more or less sort of starting to rest more easily without sort of erratic nature of the mind, either going towards lethargy or going towards distraction. The mind just starts to kind of slowly relax, I think is the best way to think about it. I always talk about I used to work on in the desert, and we built with adobe bricks. And, you go to wherever you were going to build, you'd scoop up some soil in your Nalgene or whatever, and you'd fill it, to about this much water, and you kind of like to shake it up, you let it sit. And as it sits over enough amount of time, it starts to settle. And as it settles, you start to recognize what you're working with, how much clay is there, how much is there. And then you could build your bricks based on that. You can kind of do your ratios, and then you might have to add more sand, you might have whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But so the idea of like kind of resting your mind on the mouse hole is like just letting it just letting it sit. It starts to just rest. And that's really the practice, in a nutshell, is just resting with some kind of awakeness and noticing the impulses to go want to be like, what time is it? Was that my watch right? You'll spend that amount of time just kind of, and still noticing all the subtleties of that. Or like at some point, that impulse becomes just this like tiny little undulation, like the beginning of a wave in the sea, but not actually finding any real body to it. It's just like this, you sense it coming, just like it's like an undulation, like a burp. And then it just passes, Some of them are very big. Some of the things are very big. Like if I was sitting and watching the ball go in the hoop, I was still having a lot of fear of my mother in the peripheral. So that sometimes that would eclipse the ball in the hoop, and it was like radio stations. If you had two coming through, one had more strength. Like the nightmarish sort of feeling of my mom and all the stuff coming up is really painful. It would then I'd just like breathe, relax, come back to the ball, and maybe the stations would change.
That's an interesting way to think of it too. Like you're turning the dial on a radio station, flipping the channels.
Yeah, it's part of a 9-stage process that is actually, it's like the third stage where the radio station, they start to talk about it. Like there's not necessarily for radio stations because these are Tibetans from, different era, but the idea is just that the mind very naturally just like starts to prefer certain kinds of things, and fear and all kinds of attachment based or like aversion based things that start to really take precedent a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. The topic that we were going to discuss today is sort of, quit being distracted. We work with a lot of people who work from home, a lot of freelancers, and business people nowadays in general are working from home a lot. And it is so easy to be in my house and be distracted by the need to do the laundry or to pick up the kids or to, whatever those things are, or to just find other things to do. And even if you're in an office, I think that this is true too. I actually struggle more in an office because I feel like there's always the opportunity somebody could just tap me on my shoulder and say like, hey, are you busy right now? And so finding that quietude is really important and helpful from a productivity standpoint, but I think also from a job satisfaction standpoint. Do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's I because this is the world I live in a lot, and I don't really think of it in terms of different environments. It's certainly easy to translate. I think of it like tennis. It's the same world. How when you're hitting a ball, do you stay present? It's a little bit easier because the body moves, and that's one reason why like yoga. It's actually called yoga asana because yoga is an 8-limbed approach. One of those limbs is called asana, and that's what we've come to know as yoga, like the physical movements. So asana is all about the fact that moving the body is actually quite helpful in recognizing the malleability of the mind, like of the stuff that's going on. So moving the bodies, and you know that already, probably like moving and dancing and playing, whatever. Just even play is so good for kids and otherwise for all of us. So moving the body is really helpful. Obviously, when you're sitting in office, it's not as accessible. But I think it all comes back to a daily touchstone, like we were talking about earlier, which is what are you doing daily to call attention to that? Because I think largely everything we do is habitual. Like almost probably everything we do is probably habitual. We can recognize that a lot of what we do is habit. And I think starting to create new habits is just an intention. So in the Indo-Tibetan psychological approach, new habits are formed by creating some intention to do so. That's like a really massive part of change. There's a term for it, and it's sometimes a little bit loosely used, but it's mindfulness in the sense of bringing mindfulness to the thing that you want to do. And mindfulness in Indo-Tibetan psychological approach is really just about moment-to-moment awakeness too. It's tracking moment to moment what it is you choosing to be awake to. And if without that, very little is possible, in terms of change of, I don't know. I'm in a marriage. You guys are both in marriages. If you want to change something, like how you respond to something you think is like, my wife is sometimes like, well, your face, that face. I'm like, my initial response is, my face? I can't control my face. It's my face. But that's not what she's actually saying. You know what I mean? So, but my response is that, and that's like, it's intuitive to just like defend myself and be like, well, you don't know what my face says or whatever, but the intention to change is kind of everything, like to set that forward. And so the next time she says, your face, I'm like, I recognize this pattern and I want to play out a different one. So I interject something new. Anyway, long way of saying, how in an office can you bring yourself to a kind of space that is more productive, technically speaking, is more spacious within your own heart and mind? Intention is a really big part of it. Intention to say, this is what I wanted. And it might even be really specifically making, like Maari was saying, sometimes like pragmatic approaches are really helpful to make a list of being like, these are the 5 things that I actually need in order to remain mindful. One of them is, please don't tap me on my shoulder from the hours of 10 to noon. Just being really pragmatic in your intention.
Yeah, we used to have a rule in one of the offices that I worked in that if you had your headphones on, that was your space, right? If you had your headphones off, then you were open to talking to other people.
Yes.
That was really helpful. It was very helpful because you could just visually see where people were in their, in their mind space. Because once you get into that sort of state of working and you're really into what you're thinking about and doing, and it starts really to flow, if you get pulled out of that, it can take a long time to get back in, like that, the working flow state when I'm working at home or whatever, like it's precious to me. And I hate it when it gets broken. Like I sometimes, somebody will make a noise in the house or something and it breaks and I'm just like angry. And then I go on. And that's also probably part of what you're talking about here too, is that intention, and that flow of work. I think, that's where a lot of us want to be, because we feel like we're getting a lot done in that space, but we're also more in control of what's happening. In a weird way, I can type faster, right? I can think faster. I'm more nimble mentally as we're working through that. I think a lot of people get a lot of satisfaction out of that. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, we just recently interviewed a guy who's an extreme athlete. We talked a little bit about flow and flow state with him. And, for him, because he's coming at it from the perspective of, there's danger involved in what he's doing, right? And the ability to sort of not get hurt, but also
not die. Yeah.
Right.
But also it's compressed. It's a short amount of time, what he's doing. If you're in the air and you're doing a backflip, let's say, that happens really, really quickly. So your focus and everything gets heightened in a really small window. But for most of us in our daily life, things don't get focused in quite that way. And yeah, I'm just curious, what is your perspective on flow and sort of the flow state, especially when it comes to getting things done?
Yeah, I think it's really important inquiry. And it comes back to this, which is like, the idea is that when you're in flow, everything is nice and still, and you can, meaning that the container, all the stuff that flows forth from sort of this, the container from the fluid, it's when it's like this, it's very erratic and difficult. A lot of things can happen, especially, habit is super prominent in states when things are, kind of jumbled. But then as things start to settle, you can recognize the space in which these things are arising, and then there can be some newness, like a choice. To say that flow, more or less, is just having that opportunity to sense spaciousness. And actually, there's a lot of good cognitive science around this too, is like a lot of meshing of the worlds, that in this state, you are more efficient. We think of ourselves as multitaskers, but it's really not about the efficiency of multitasking is much less so than when you're in flow state. The efficiency is much higher. And what flow state, in my mind, in my world, actually translates to is awareness. And it's a very specific definition. When you are resting in awareness, which is like a little bit more spacious by nature, there's also a well-being that arises very naturally. And we all know this, like when you're talking about flow state, it feels good. It feels good to be efficient and proficient. It feels good to not be distracted and erratic in the way we're seeing and experiencing the world, emotionally, psychologically, when things are more still. And still doesn't necessarily mean quiet. There's still stuff in here to see and experience, even though largely the container is still. And that's the beauty in Tibetan psychology, is that you're not trying to quiet the mind in the way that maybe people tend to think of it. It's not that things stop flowing within the mind. That would mean you're probably no longer alive, right? It's the idea that there is this pervasive quality of rest, of stillness, that is not necessarily without movement, but we recognize the space and the movement simultaneously. And that's a recipe for well-being. Of course, that's the terminology in Indo-Tibetan psychology. But I think what we all know and feel is that when we're in that space, there's fluidity. There's just there's doing without there's doing without cognizing, or like being bound by cognitive function. You can obviously be cognitive. You have to be, especially if there's things to compute mentally, but you can do that cognitive functioning while still sort of resting in some kind of spaciousness. Does that feel true to you all?
There's a connectedness that feels a lot more holistic than, I played basketball and we've all played sports here. And I think there's a difference between playing the sport versus just being in the sport. And I think whatever you're doing, I'm dribbling, I'm shooting, And when you're in that moment where you're connected, it's all happening kind of simultaneously. I'm wondering, is there a difference between like quietude versus flow, or is it kind of the same thing? It is that awareness connected to just general connectivity. I'd love to hear more about quietude and the practice and how you talk about it. The more podcasts we do, the more I see this through line of just being aware. And John and I, we always talk about like, for us, paying attention is one of our big core values, talking about paying attention. But you're even taking it a step further where you're saying it's like being aware in each of those moments, and how it's like when you think about awareness, you think about focusing and being small, but it actually creates more space because you're aware, but you're visioning bigger, which is kind of an interesting, opposite sides kind of thing.
Definitely. And that's a really astute differentiation, because those are the two words that we use in Indo-Tibetan psychology, which is there's a difference actually between attention and awareness. Attention is a very sort of left hemispherical functioning, where it's like categorical, it's very identification oriented, and awareness is much more global, right hemispherical experiencing, which is more, my wife will say, it's the whole gestalt. Like you take in everything in the simultaneous, which seems, it's using these words that sound so clumsy in some ways. It's like, what does that mean? What the F does this mean? Because that's really, people are like, this is so loose, this idea, but it really isn't in actuality, because we each know it in our own functioning. Yep. So resting in that right hemispherical, more sort of global awareness allows for key element here. And I draw this from a book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And so it's one of the a polymath from our time. And his approach through cognitive science is to say that right hemispherical experiencing includes the left hemispherical experiencing, but the left hemispherical experiencing only knows itself. So like when you are in that left hemispherical kind of operational mode, we call that in Indo-Tibetan psychology conceptuality, all within the realm of concept. You cannot necessarily know the space. You cannot know awareness. But from within awareness, absolutely no problem functioning with conceptuality at all. And that's where, again, this model works the same, where there's rest and knowing awareness, we just sort of think about the fluid as awareness. There are ways in which you can know all these individual aspects of knowing, that there's different ways to know. Like you were just describing, Maari, like the idea of knowing how to play basketball in its parts. Well, that's very conceptual. You would be like, okay, here, push the button, follow through, whatever, make sure you've got extended. And then if John knows this well too, when trying to figure those things out, and piece by piece, very difficult. You're definitely conceptual there. And when do you suck the most? When you're largely conceptual, especially in athletics, right? Because everybody's like, you're thinking too much. Like that's the whole idea. And so, stop cognitively processing all the parts. And like you're saying, Maari, as you slip back into that sort of spaciousness, they all just seem to arise in the simultaneous and possible. It's all things become sort of possible in that space. Really starting to recognize the difference of those functions, awareness and attention, is another one of those intentional ways of starting to identify the process of the mind. It always seems to come back to just wanting to do something in order to do something, right? Like neuroplasticity. I was reading this study. There's a guy intentionally wanting to learn to play piano. And he spent some period of time visualizing playing the piano. And it was set up against the guy who didn't do any visualization at all. And they came to learn at the same skill level, and they were learning this one piece of music. And the guy who had done the visualization was far further along. It's the kind of thing where you set the intention forward and you start to kind of give over some of your habitual mind space, and it starts to create those habits. This is one of the ways in which they say to do this in Tibetan psychology: put the list together. Put these individual parts together. Speak them out, know them, identify them, define them, get a real sense of them. Very conceptual, necessarily left hemispherical experiencing. But then once you've done that, relax, let go of it, release, and practice intuiting those things that you already know conceptually. They will flow forth, meaning you can know the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. So you will still know them. It's not like you lose connection with that which was conceptual, but now you're using it in this much more non-conceptual kind of way, which is much more flow-oriented.
That's a really insightful way to put it. I think I've taught tennis now for over 10 years. And the way in which I teach tennis today is very different from the way that I did 10 years ago. I was very much the, do this, do this, do this. And now, like a couple nights ago, I was teaching some beginners how to hit underspin or slice and topspin. And instead of showing them how to hold the racket, and instead of showing them how to use their arm and their hand, I simply said, if you want to hit slice, look at the bottom part of the ball and hit the bottom part of the ball. And if you want to hit topspin, look at the top part of the ball and hit the top part of the ball. And then I just let them do that for an hour. And I sort of just got out of the way and just said, and that was the only reminder that I had was, find a way to hit the bottom of the ball, find a way to hit the top of the ball. And at the end of the hour, the progress was pretty significant. And I'm not sure that it would have been as significant if I had said, okay, here's all the little steps you have to do in order to hit it this way and in order to hit it that way. And that's a little bit, I think, about what you're talking about too. I had a clear direction, but that direction was intention. It wasn't how to do it. I took the left brain out of it that way.
Yes. Yeah. And you're also describing another aspect of the process, which is like, they call it preconceptual, conceptual, and post-conceptual, which is like, you have to be inspired to do something. There has to be this preconceptual reason to do something. And that might just be getting your body to go through the motion of like, up top of the ball, bottom of the ball, top of the ball, or you have to have some motivation within your own, space, mental space. Like, I want to be in the office more mindfully, whatever that means to the individual. That's sort of this preconceptual version. I'm motivated, but then you get conceptual. So maybe the people get inspired, by that session for an hour, and they go home and they're like, I want to know more. So they get very conceptual about it and they start to list it out. That's no problem. That's the conceptual elaboration that they were working with pre-conceptual motivation. But then like the really important step, not necessarily the most important, but a very, very important step, which often gets overlooked, is post-conceptual, which is now get out of the conceptual space that you spent that time identifying and really learning about. I mean, rabbit holes on YouTube or whatever it is, and get out of that, back to whatever it is you're trying to do, or back to the office after you've conceptualized, and now start practicing. Start getting back into the body, get back into that more non-conceptual or post-conceptual space.
So talk about that a little bit. Once we engage the left hemisphere, once we're in that conceptual world, it's really hard then for the left hemisphere to let go of that control. And we see, tennis as the example again, but we see this in tennis all the time. You miss a shot and then you have all the technical reasons why, instead of observing it, accepting it, and moving on, the left brain still wants to kick in and say, yeah, but you screwed up. And I think when we're working in the business world or we're working with teams, that's also a point of struggle and contention sometimes. The left brain from multiple people, or even just from yourself, comes in and gets in the way at times. And that's a really big challenge because you all have the same goal. You all want to execute it. It's almost like maybe a different way to look at project management that we could talk about at some point or something. Just this idea of like, okay, once you've listed all the stuff out and you know what the steps are and you know how it's going to be and you know who's assigned to it, that then there becomes maybe a play space or something before you judge it,
letting go
for what it is. I don't know. We work with a lot of creatives. And so in that creative world, there's a lot of like, okay, here's the brief, here are the things that you need to do. And then you give it back to somebody for feedback. And then it's all very left hemisphere stuff, but then they're also challenged to come up with new ideas and all that. And it's, I think, a really hard thing for people to balance.
Yeah. And so much, I think, is we come back to some of the same concepts. Number one is sort of identifying that non-conceptual place, meaning that right hemisphere experiencing, that awareness that we've been talking about. And that is maybe a daily practice of some sort, or even just a daily practice of identifying the desire to do so. Maybe it just starts there, which is like, I just need to identify that more spacious way of knowing. And I think this is a really big part of what you're just talking about, and a really important part of it, which is left hemispheric experiencing tends to move outward. It tends to like tell you what to do. It tends to like project my idea specifically into your brain so that it becomes truth. It sounds ridiculous, but this is really what we're doing a lot of the time. Is like, I come back to relationships, so I don't put it on your office space. It's the same, which is like, I tell my wife, no, you're wrong. This is right. here's how it's right. This is the definition of correct. And of course, I'm overemphasizing the ridiculousness of it, but it's kind of true. Like where I'm saying to her, in all the ways, you're wrong. You know what I mean? Like, I'm right, you're wrong, here's how. And that's obviously ridiculous when you hear it that way, but it is much less ridiculous when you're in it and feeling a lot and saying, no, I need to be seen here, I need to be heard here, I need to be felt here. And if you were using those words, maybe you would be different. It would be different. You would probably be a little bit more in that right hemispherical experiencing if you were saying that, because, and this is one of those major portions of what it is to be in that right hemispherical, the right hemispherical experiencing is much more receptive. So like it's less about doing, like imposing all the right ideas. And it's more about asking maybe some of the right questions and more about like receiving more about what it is that's influencing someone else so that we can understand each other, so that we can become more connected and be more effective. Efficaciousness or being effective is directly related to connectivity. And whether it be connected to your own ideas, to your own sense of flow, or whether it be you're connected to someone else's impulses and needs and desires, they can become far more effective when they feel seen, known, and understood. Very difficult, very, very difficult. And again, I come back to the marriage. Very difficult to be effective when all I'm doing is trying to tell you something. You tell me, how effective is it when you try to shove some truth down your partner's throat?
Yeah.
Right. And that goes nowhere. Well, John said to me one time, and this is I still remember this. I think it's so insightful. And it's when you're dealing with a conflict and he's like, what happens when you come to the table and you're 100% right and they're 100% right? And it's like, I think we find ourselves in so many of those situations, especially as business owners, but also just as humans existing in the world that we live in. And you see a lot of it. And it's such a stopper when you come to the table with like, absolutely, I'm 100% right, because we live in such a world of gray areas. And if you can approach it knowing that we could both be 100% right and walk away cordial, I think that's like such a huge lesson to understand, because it's like you come to the table, and I see this with coaching and athletics, and you come to the table, like I'm telling you how to do it. And it's like, it's not going to be received, so it's an end. There's not a beginning there. And so I think that's something that's really, really truthful, is like how you approach those conversations.
Absolutely. And that, back to the sort of how do we move into that, you can identify, if you're starting to kind of identify these things, in Tibetan psychology, they call them pointing out instructions. If you can point this out to yourself, if I am imposing my will 100% because I believe in my correctness, I know where I am. I know that I am largely, or maybe even purely conceptual. I am in this place where I am not receptive. This might be a place where I want to soften the edges a little bit. My son is a competitive soccer player. So I say to him, when you're kind of bound in your mind, look up at the sky, take a breath, relax, just soften the edges, just soften the edges. And whatever it is that you are fixated on usually finds itself able to set sail, and just at least a little bit. You're looking at it like if it gets smaller and smaller for a while. If we recognize that we are right and righteously so, we probably can identify that and point that out to ourselves, like, not where I'm most effective. Let me soften the edges. Let me relax a little bit. Maybe even by one of my pragmatic approaches, like number 4 is ask a good question. Okay, what's my number 4? Okay, here I go. I'm going to ask a good question and I'm going to relax and see if I can receive it. Those are practical ways to find your way.
Yeah. So you've mentioned number 3 and number 4. Can you give us a rundown? All of
I remember you were sort of, Maari, you were talking about lists. I actually have a little bit of a thing, but then I've been kind of exploring this on Monday nights at our business called Shala. Monday nights in Shala, we've been talking about what is this process, because everybody is talking about the same thing, because it's not really specific to office space or to corporate America or to sports or to relationships. This seems to have its tendrils in just about everything. I would actually venture to say everything, not just about. I think it has its tendrils in every way in which we interact and are connected. For anything to have a sense of newness. And this, we were originally talking about, John, the idea of this being about quitting, the idea of what to quit. And I mulled that over in a lot of different ways. But one of the things that this fits in beautifully with is how do you start a new habit? How do you come to do something new? And so the first word is like newness, is this recognition of newness. And there in this model, there are four. So newness is the first. And it may not be necessarily an experience of newness, but it is the desire for newness. Like you may at the very first be like, there is something new I'm after. You identify it, you bring it into your focus for a bit, attention. At that point, it's conceptual, right? You bring it into your attentional stability arena and you say, I'm into something, I want something new. You identify it, you think about it, you spend your time with it. But then there is, within this space of newness, when you start to kind of soften the edges, we become closer to connection. When you had said that already, Maari, like there is this knowable place of connectivity. And it's a hard thing to really even articulate because we use that word, but what does that mean? So, in that space of newness arises a very natural connection, awakeness to connection. What that means is different to everyone. These words we have to unpack, and we do that a lot. But that newness that lends itself to connectivity then kind of arises naturally. And this word I like to really break open a lot. Probably not enough time to do it, but is gratitude. And gratitude isn't like, you know what, John, I'm super stoked for you. Although that's sweet. That's a sweet way of saying it. Like, I'm really grateful for John. Or Maari, I'm super grateful for you. That's actually obviously a really great thing to have. But this is more subtle because it's in that space of newness where we sense connection. And that is like interconnectivity, I think is the better word for that idea of connection. We sense interconnectivity, whether it be through our work, through our typing, through, whatever you're saying, John, like flowing through typing. I'm not a better typer. I'm a better guitar player. I'm a better whatever. All of a sudden, things are flowing in connectivity or interconnectivity. There's like a gentle sweetness to that. This would like sort of flowing sweetness, and almost the word I really like to use is tenderness. It's a tender space where like all in that new interconnected space, like the way your fingers move, the way you're typing, it's all knowable and it's in your sense fields. There's a tenderness to it. There's like a knowable, palpable well-being. And that's the gratitude I'm talking about. Like it's a place where you can identify the well-being that arises there. And then the last word is like, then what do you do? The last one is, how do you become from that place? What do you become from that place? And I mean like human becoming versus, you know what I mean? What are you going to do? And if you're resting in that sort of, or awake to that newness, interconnectivity / like kind of well-being-ish, tender space, what you're going to do is likely what you do would be an expression of compassion. And I don't mean compassion like, again, oh, John skinned his knee, or Maari, I'm really sorry about that. Although it could be that, and that's fine too. It's more about how we receive in that space. How are we open in that place? Like what questions are you asking? What are you doing to lend of yourself in that space that grows the compassionate response from the other person? If you're doing it with a keyboard, like how are you extending, from your fingers into the board, that same kind of tenderness? So like you're receiving, it sounds silly, but if you're playing guitar or whatever, your fingers soften, the edges are softer, and you become in the world, or in this way, you become more connectable. People around you sense it too.
Yeah. How do expectations play into that? And so what I mean there is, we're going to go back to sports because that's a simple analogy, I think, in this case. When people are seeking to achieve something, they put an expectation in their head. I call these the shoulds. Like, I should have hit this ball there. I should be able to beat this person because they're not as good as me. I should be able to, and it's those expectations that I find that get in my way when I'm trying to perform or do whatever at the best of my ability. The days when I pick up the guitar and I have no expectation, it's great. The days when I go on the tennis court and I have no expectation, it's great. The days when I look across the net and go like, I'm winning today, this will be easy. Oh, those days usually are not so good. So that's something that I've been noticing lately in my own performance, in whatever I'm doing at the time. But also I notice it a lot in the people that I coach and teach. I just feel like sometimes that expectation gets in the way of our ability to be open, our ability to be compassionate, our ability to recognize the connectivity, like all of those types of things. And the reason I brought it up really was when you started to talk about compassion, it kind of hit the nail on the head for me that maybe that's the missing link. In that, if I have those expectations and I'm trying to impose my expectations on this situation, very left hemisphere kind of thing, I'm imposing it, right? Then that means that I can't be compassionate and open to the possibilities, to the other possibilities. So one of the things I think, bringing it back to tennis again, is if I look at the other side of the net and I say, oh, Jarret, I'm going to beat you today very easily. I'm not respecting you as my opponent. I have very little compassion in that way for you, all the hard work you've put in, all of those types of things. So,
yeah, I think that's valid. I think to simplify it too, all the expectations are what? They're largely conceptual. Meaning they live within a way of experiencing. Concepts are like dried concrete. Like there's no life within them. They're very helpful. They give us ways of cognizing and of communicating experiences, but they don't actually necessarily live within the realm of living, breathing, ever effulging kind of experiences. They're solid.
Right.
And we put these concepts together as if they're a living and breathing thing, but they're really not. They're just sort of like pasted up conceptually. What's the word? Conceptual overlay. It's like an overlay onto the living and breathing reality that we tend to experience in that open, sort of tender way. We put the conceptual sort of overlay on top of it and pretend it's the same thing. And that way things don't change. That's the thing about concepts is they're unchanging. They're concrete. They are what they are. They're building blocks for articulation, but they're not living and breathing and opening and ever expanding and ever effulging like kind of all things really are. So they're projections, if you will. If they are predominant in your experiencing, then you will never have the opportunity to rest in that well-being, that spaciousness, and that way of becoming that is compassion-oriented, because you're simply resting in the concepts. And so now, again, the same idea is true. What do you do with expectations? What do you do with the desires and all the ways in which we want to articulate pragmatically or otherwise, even just like to measure success? What do we do with them? Well, I think of them, and this is my favorite analogy, is I think of them as farts in the wind. Because like the idea is that, if you're standing amidst somebody who farts next to you in the wind, or you yourself, let's put it on us, we whatever, and it's knowable, it's real, you can smell it and it's sensible. But then if you try to bottle it up and create something out of it, it's ridiculous. The idea of like trying to put that into something that is concrete that then I can use later is ridiculous. It's laughable. Concepts are meant to arise, they spend their time, and then they self-release if we don't give into them and start to kind of like string them together with stuff. Emotions arise, abide, and self-release, unless we start to weave together stories. And then now you're living in all of this weaved conceptual space, when in fact what you felt came and went a long time ago. You felt hurt just then. If I sat with that, felt hurt, feel the hurt, and then like let it simply release, soften the edges, let it move. It's okay to have the fart. You know what I mean? No problem. It comes, it self-releases. And now I'm still resting. Now, again, I'm resting in that spacious sort of well-being that can then move into the world with connectivity. Does that make any sense?
It does. It's a very, very vivid way of explaining it. Yeah. All right. That's cool. So, we've been talking here for a little while, for about an hour or so. So we're gonna hop into what we call the lightning round, which is just 3 questions we've got here, relatively straightforward. Just quick answers, whatever first comes to your head. What is one misconception of meditation that you'd like to correct?
That you have to be good at it. Yeah, that you have to accomplish something. That you have to have accomplished something, or that you have to have certain tendencies to be quote good at it. There's no such thing. There really isn't.
Do you find that it's that, and this maybe I'm saying, kind of revealing myself, that I work with a lot of like female CEOs and founders, and there's always conversation around meditation because that group tends to always be seeking different things. And there's always an interesting conversation around how people are starting. They're like, well, I sat down, I did this. And I think me being too, sometimes like I like a list, and so do they. And it's like, what's the right way to do it? And that I have the things set at the right temperature. Do you find when you are instructing people that they get caught in the rules as opposed to just fumbling into it and just working at it. What's your experience with kind of coaching and teaching people?
One of the first things I'd like to say is that this practice is all about relaxation and deep rest. It's not actually about accomplishing anything. You can't accomplish your way. Good luck, right? To clarity, because the clarity of this will never, in all of the doing, it just continually agitates there is no doing. The practice is undoing. And that's the greatest thing I like to impart when we start is it's relaxation based. It's it's totally receptive. It's an undoing. If you find yourself doing, just relax. And it's a matter of really just letting things naturally occur. There's the agitation that occurs, of course, because that's part of the nature of the mind. There's lethargy that can occur. And even like gross lethargy, you might fall asleep. You know what I mean? No problem. But it's all part of starting to discover what we call the nature of the mind. Instead of like creating something, you're discovering. Instead of doing, you're sitting in the receptive seat of discovery. And that discovery is absolutely relaxation-based, and it's a receptive kind of process. Reception, relaxation, deep, I like to say like deep existential rest. And that doesn't mean anything until you actually start to kind of know what I mean. And I'm sure each of you has an intuition. But those kinds of, that is packaged alongside like the intention / the luminosity of the mind. So you want to definitely keep the luminosity, like that there is presence. It's deep, deep rest, but with an awakeness, with a sort of luminous quality to discovery. Because how do you discover without, being awake and luminous?
This kind of comes back to almost exactly what you said, but have you ever fallen asleep while meditating?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's normal. It's normal. The process of, and I like to unpack meditation too. Sorry for like expanding the lighting. This is a lighting storm. Yeah. All right. Good. The idea is like, that when you set out to rest deeply, the gross lethargy is sleep. And that's okay. I tell people, if you fall asleep, you did good. Because that means that you're not ruminating. You're not in that ideative kind of a distracted place for the whole time. It's okay. You rested deeply. But next time, when you hear my voice and you wake up, you just come back to the practice as we've laid it out. But sleep is no problem. With the intention to really identify and rest within and start to point out to yourself what these qualities of mind are: attention, awareness, stillness, whatever it is we're working on. Just remember that intention, or come back to that intention once you've come out of that gross lethargy.
Cool. Name one simple thing, or give us one simple thing that our listeners can do this week to improve their mindfulness, their awareness, and to reduce their distractions.
One thing is to breathe, be awake to your breath, meaning just call attention, call awakeness and intention to breathing. For a cycle of breath, an out breath and an in breath. Just be awake to one of those every hour. Set the intention that every hour, just recognize an out breath and an in breath. Could be sensations of breathing. Just become awake once an hour.
I like that.
And that could be one cycle of breath.
I like that. That's a good one. Cool. All right. Well, a big thank you. Thank you so much for coming on today. Yeah, we've enjoyed this. It's been fun.
Yes.
And like Maari said earlier, it has been very fascinating to notice that every person that we've interviewed, this idea of awareness keeps over and over.
Pay attention.
Pay attention, whether you're paying attention in large crowds when there are people around, which would have been our conversation with Terry or today or with Josh, the pay attention part. So interesting. But yeah, as we wrap this up, tell our audience where they can find you if they'd like to learn more about you, your practice, if they're in Durham locally. Tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, so we run a business, my wife and I, and it's called Shala, Shala, which just means home in Sanskrit. And it's kind of home for this kind of work, like a home where you can rest within community and practice connecting and communicating and receptive ways of being. And so Shala is home, but home in that kind of like intentional way. That's at 819 Broad Street. We're there all the time, a lot of the time. Mira is there teaching asana regularly, and also some things like lots of different offerings. I'm there on Mondays doing sort of an ongoing quietude. I call it quietude club. And then we have a website. It's 108yogalove.com, and it's got all the stuff on it. It's really a home base for Shala. Cool. But one thing I just want to say on the way out is, it's kind of feeling this thing about hope, or how people are like kind of, these are trying times in the world at large. Forget elections and other things, but all the things. And I just was thinking about this in terms of our conversation and like the idea of hope. And I was thinking that I just want to leave it here. It's like hope is in action. You know what I mean? It's not a wish. And whatever it is, like, Mahatma Gandhi was saying lots of years ago, like you do in the world, you be in the world, whether it's that change you would like to see. And I just like, if you're looking for change, and if you're looking for change, whether it's in an office space or otherwise, and the hope that gets garnered and created is from action. I mean, that's the thing that I really feel a lot right now. And so we can have wishes, and wishes are really important, but the action of is seemingly the most important.
Love it.
100%. Yeah.
And we're back. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jarret. Jarret is such a thoughtful person. He really considers not just himself, but other people. And you can really see that when we're talking to him, I felt like.
Yeah, he surprised me that this is, I haven't met him face to face, but I had you always have a kind of an idea of what a meditative person will be like. And he's pretty funny. Like he had some zingers and some surprising twists of words and things like that. So I really enjoyed our conversation.
What are you going to quit based on what we just talked about?
So I thought he did a good job of talking about the idea of not holding on to things too tightly. So quit latching onto things that are no longer serving you. But I like that he had, not holding on to things too tightly and learning to really let go of those things without judgment or any kind of label. So just use it while you need it and then let it go and let something else fill its space. So I'm going to quit trying to hold on to those things too tightly and not pass judgment on things when they need to end or exit my life.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. I'm going to quit. I'm trying to see things with so much definition. I'm going to try to get out of the weeds. I really liked the way he talked about softening the edges when he was explaining sort of his son being frustrated on the soccer field and just telling him to look up at the sky, take a deep breath, and just kind of soften the edges. You're not trying to get rid of the entire frustration or the struggle or the details or whatever it is. You're just trying to see it in sort of a soft focus so that you can get some perspective from it. It doesn't feel quite as intense, that those emotions or feelings or even like a problem that you're trying to solve. You just soften the edges a little bit. I really like that. So that's what I'm going to start trying to do. I'm going to start trying to take that deep breath, look up at the sky, and just zoom out just a little bit.
Yeah, I thought that was really great because I always think about that situation with younger people and children because they haven't had as much bad stuff that everything seems so terrible. But honestly, even as adults, especially I think as we get through the end of the day, I try not to make any big decisions or send out any aggressive emails or phone calls at the end of the day because I'm tired. Everything seems like a big deal with the idea of just sleep on it. But I like the idea of backing up and taking that perspective that's not so up in your face. I thought that was a really good thought.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Do we have any other takeaways or anything else we want to highlight here in this conversation?
I really liked the idea of being a receiver. We had talked a little bit about just my kind of prayer practice, meditative practice that, when you're sitting and you're kind of outputting in life in general, I'm always going out and doing things and we're all kind of trying to achieve or trying to better stuff. But sometimes I thought, just sitting and letting things come to you and happen to you, whether it's in meditation or just you do something and you're outputting something, just sit and let it figure itself out. I think that's really hard for me because I'm always a pusher and I'm just like, let's just go, go, go. But I think the value in letting things happen back to you and letting them kind of come into your purview, I think was a really cool takeaway too.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I thought it was interesting when he said, you don't have to be good at meditation. There's no such thing as being good at it. Meditation, the practice, not doing, it's undoing. It's leaving yourself open for discovery. When I've tried to meditate in the past, I've judged my meditation, which seems very counterintuitive, but also I think a lot of people probably do.
Yeah.
And just knowing that I can take a deep breath once an hour and just focus on that breath and then go back. Just be mindful of my body and my breath once an hour and start there. Seems like a pretty low bar and seems like a pretty simple thing that we could do.
I like the small little, like you can do this one thing but it's for such an achievement oriented world, especially in the United States. It's like, if I'm going to start something, what do I need to do to level up for my 10-year-old son? What do I need to do to be the best at meditating? If there's not something to be the best at, you can feel like I'm not moving forward. So I think it's an interesting challenge to offer, that you're not trying to do it, you're trying to undo it. I think that's a really cool challenge to put on ourselves.
And like you said, in a world where we're constantly doing and achieving and striving, that it just gives you a different perspective, a different way to look at things. I don't always have to be achieving. I don't always have to be striving to be the best meditator in the world. It's kind of an oxymoron when you really start to think about it and understand it, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that about does it for this week. Thank you so much for joining Command Q and learning a little bit about how we can become more mindful and embrace the newness in the things that we quit. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but in the meantime, you're welcome to join our quitting community at commandqpodcast.com. Until next time, I'm John.
And I'm Maari.
And we're reminding you that quitters can win and winners can quit.